Welcome back. From the oil and gas sector, we wish we had more time to explore the conversation with Kelvin Emmanuel, who does a yeoman's job of explaining the technicalities in that sector. But let's move on to other conversations that has to do with how it affects you, especially if you live in Lagos and the issue of housing and rent is of concern to you. You have to be part of this conversation. We've been joined on the program by the I almost said governorship, chairmanship candidate in the last local government election in Etiosa, Mr. Ayodele Adio. He's a politician, a communication expert, and many more. Thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me. Always good to be here.
You know, when Nigerians, especially Lagosians, let me say it like someone Lagosians, hear about rent, everybody's up to know what's happening. In fact, I was listening to radio. Somebody was saying there are landlords from hell and there are tenants from hell. So it's like it's a shared responsibility. But I know that you talked about the fact that the rent incident in Lagos, the issue of rent is very disturbing. So let's perhaps raise the conversation from what you know that has led you to begin to think of what can we do about rent, the astronomical increase in the price of housing and houses. It's just totally unacceptable.
I mean, just like you said, you've qualified it perfectly that it's unacceptable. The average working person in Lagos is expending between 60% to 70% of their income on housing and transportation. Now, that leaves you with about 30% left to pay fees, to pay electricity, energy, and perhaps to run your own life, which makes it very unrealistic to plan for your future, to plan for retirement. And if by chance or by accident you lose your job, you really are in perennial crisis. And so you cannot expect people to live their lives in a mega city where most of their income is being soaked up by the astronomical hikes in rents without whatever control whatsoever, right? And so I think it's important that we sort of find a way to halt this unreasonable rise of rent. Otherwise, it's going to mount a huge amount of pressure on working families that we have never seen in an entire generation. And you know, it's not just that rents are growing at an astronomical level, it's the fact that the path to home ownership has completely eluded an entire generation. So if you think about people who lived in perhaps our fathers or grandfathers' generation, there was an easier path to home ownership, even though in terms of income and earnings, they were earning less than we are doing today. But the harsh reality is that the path to home ownership for the average working person in Lagos, except you beg, borrow, or steal, is almost impossible to dream about. And that cannot be tenable, in the current society that we live in today.
So do you have like an example of what we're dealing with? Because people would like to contextualize, especially on the island where everything sounds luxury, even when it's not luxury. I know of a gentleman, I've forgotten his name, who does these videos comparing Nigerian luxury versus luxuries outside our country, maybe places like South Africa and other climes that he feels that they really understand the dynamics of real estate. So let's talk about specifically, if you were to make a proposal or a recommendation, if you will. So let's just jump straight to that, as to how this can be tackled. So depending on where you are, for the average person, how much should a one-bedroom, a self-con, I don't know all the many descriptions it gives to these houses.
So the reality is we can't do that. We can't say that depending on where you are, how much should the average one-bedroom cost or an average two-bedroom, because that would be difficult to contextualize, right? But what we can say fundamentally is that the cost of rent and the pathway to home ownership must be grounded in reality, which is based on wages and income, right? But at the moment, it is clear that rents are running faster than what wages and income can catch up with. And that's why, to solve this problem, we have to pursue a multifaceted approach, because the reality is the core of the problem is the lack of supply into the market. The Lagos State government over the last 24 years hasn't invested nearly enough in public housing or in affordable housing to bridge the supply gap in the market. And it's left that arena completely for the private sector, who thinks squarely about earning a profit from the properties that they develop. And that's why you see rents continue to climb. So what we currently are experiencing is a crisis that we have to halt with a short-term measure, a mid-term, and a long-term. And so as a short-term measure, the first thing that we need to do is to place certain caps on the rent hikes. And I'm proposing 3 very simple things that we need to do. The first is that we need to cap the cost of agency fees and legal fees at 5%. And once we do that, we cut the entire cost of the ridiculous 20% rate on agencies and agreements that are currently being charged by unscrupulous agents across the state. The second thing that we need to do is the notice of the increase of rent. Today, as we speak, a landlord can issue you a notice to raise his rents by 100 and 200% with just 4 months to the expiration of your rent. And it's totally legal. And that is unacceptable because people plan their rents over a year period. And to wake up 4 months to when your rent is expiring and somebody is increasing your rent by 100 or 200% is borderline ludicrous. So I am proposing that we must ensure that the notice of increase of rent must be 12 months so that you have a year, because that's the entire life cycle that it takes us to plan to pay our rent, to make a decision whether you can afford that property or not. So that's also sacrosanct. The third thing, and I think the most important thing, is to cap the amount of rent increase on properties that are currently occupied as we speak. And that cap has to be based on inflation. And let me break it down. It means that if inflation was 15% last year, a landlord can raise his house rents by 15% and have the cap between 5 to 10% differential depending on the locality in Lagos. By extension, it means that you can raise your rents by between 20 and 25% and not the ridiculous 100 and 200% that we continue to see across Lagos. So that, for me, are the 3 things that if we do in the short term, we can succeed in capping the hike of rents as we speak currently, and while supply tends to catch up going forward, because you cannot address it only by capping rents and pursuing these things that I've said. You also at the same time need to deal with the supply end, which we have failed spectacularly in doing as we speak.
Well said.
You know, if you've had to try to get a house recently or at any time in Lagos, even in other parts of the country, but particularly Lagos, then you know that there's extreme sports, and then there's trying to get a house in Lagos. The things you will see, the things you will hear, and we shouldn't live like this, really. I understand the context of the economy, and that's leading to my question. I understand the context of the economy. Sometimes it's unpredictable. There hidden costs even for the landlords themselves, and I know that things work differently in other climes. There's proper legislation, there's capping, even though it's still largely decided by demand and supply, right? But I'm curious, have you maybe tried to have a sit down with a landlord or a few landlords to understand the thinking? And I don't want to take this to agents and all of that. I don't know if you'll probably be successful with that kind of conversation, because it's business. The business is a business. But have you tried to sit down with them to understand what exactly is responsible? Because look at the inflation rate, like look at the rate of increase in wages, but then look at your own rent increase. Yeah. It doesn't quite make sense, but they may have their reasons. Have you tried to do that?
Well, first of all, if you notice that from the beginning, I haven't tried to blame landlords here, which I have argued fundamentally that the root cause of this problem is the lack of supply into the market. The fact that the Lagos State government has completely hands off public housing. That is the bane of the crisis here. That we have left, new housing stock in the hands of private sector actors alone. And that, for me, is what is driving the scarcity and pushing the prices upwards. So it's not so much as if it's the landlords to blame. And that's why when I'm even proposing the rent caps, right, I'm proposing that it should be benchmarked against inflation, and you give a 5 to 10% differential for them to put on top of it and nothing beyond that. And I'm also proposing it as a short-term measure, because you cannot, continuously over time cap the rents upon which landlords can charge, especially in a market where there's actually no supply. But here's the thing. There's a philosophical root to this crisis. And that philosophical root is to treat housing merely as a commodity that is to be traded and speculated upon, and not a public good. And the moment you treat housing as a commodity that can only be exchanged, you stop thinking about the people who are occupying these houses and the people who can, and you start to think about who can pay the most for these houses. And that's the crisis that we're in today, because housing is purely viewed today in Lagos as a commodity and not a public good. And unfortunately, rather than pursue public-private partnerships that should bridge the supply problem in Lagos State, what we have seen over the years is that public-private partnership has also decided to pursue capital in Lagos State, where they are seeking profits from the initiatives that they pursue as we speak. And I've consistently argued that you can't use public land, public incentive, to pursue public projects that excludes the public from public housing. It makes no sense whatsoever. I give you an example because you asked for global context earlier on. In Paris today, 25% of the housing stock is public housing. In fact, they have an ambitious goal that by 2035, which is about 10 years from now, 45% of the housing stock will be public housing, because they recognize the importance of the dignity and the stability that housing brings to working people. But unfortunately, we seem to have divorced it here in Lagos. I give you a typical example. A lot of people do not realize how many people have lost their jobs over the last 2 years, given the hike in transportation and housing. Because when people move to the outskirts of the city, take Badagry, take the outskirts of Ikorodu, but the central business district is Victoria Island and Lekki. Now, when you weigh the cost of transportation to come all the way from Badagry or from Ikorodu to the central business district, it doesn't match with reality. The pay cannot even cover your cost of transportation, and people are losing jobs because of a failed housing policy. So I think at the core of it, if we begin to treat housing as a public good and as a necessity to promote the dignity and the rights of citizens who live and work and make this city function, then we'll begin to pursue policies that are a lot more realistic, that allows and affords the average working person to not just pay fair rents, but to be able to own a home in his lifetime.
And that's what I want to follow up on, because you have rightly posited that the public housing policy excludes those who really need it. And, my question is, why is the government and successive administrations, why are they unable to replicate the Jakonde housing policy that we often refer to, that empowered the generation of the 80s, and the 70s? Why does the public housing policy exclude the working class and the middle class of today?
I think you just have your finger right on the button, which I explained earlier. It's a philosophical problem. Jakonde believed that the working people deserved dignity. He believed that the working people deserved security, and he invested in public housing and welfareist program that protected working people and afforded and accorded them dignity. Unfortunately, what we have experienced over the last 24 years, and like I repeat, is some sort of a neoliberal thinking that places profits above people, and such that we're even using public-private partnerships to pursue luxury properties in Lagos, which for me is a complete aberration. Because at the end of the day, if people are excluded from public housing, if people use all of their income to pay rents and to pay transportation, you would have pauperized a consumption economy like Lagos and reduced the purchasing powers of individuals and stagnate the economy, because people would not be able to buy goods and services when all of their income is tied to housing and transportation. And I think it's also important that there's this laissez-faire attitude, this hands-off approach for, I don't know what to even call it, where public officers just believe things will sort themselves out. And there's just very little or no intervention whatsoever in the market space. Take, for instance, the Airbnb phenomenon, which is also pushing the cost of property up in Lagos. There's a global consensus. In fact, a study was done in Barcelona that the concentration of Airbnbs in specific districts in the country push the prices of rent by at least 7% upwards. And that's another phenomenon that we're experiencing in Lagos, particularly in the Lekki-Ajah corridor and in certain places on the mainland, the concentration of Airbnbs. And we have to regulate that, because major cities across the world have capped the amount of nights that you can have short rental stays in any locality. In Barcelona, it is 30%. In London, it's 90 days. In Amsterdam, it's 90 days. You cannot just build a property and exclusively put it at short stay rentals all year long. I mean, no city in the world that thinks about the cost of rents and about public housing policy will allow investments to go extremely or exclusively into people investing massively in short stay rentals, especially concentrated in specific municipalities across the state. It makes no sense. So we either have to tax these short stay rentals heavily, so that that funding can be channeled into funding public housing, or we bring the sledgehammer and place back regulations that are already global standards, that you cannot afford short stay rentals for more than 30 nights to 60 nights, depending on the policy of tourism in that particular state, because it takes out housing that is supposed to come for the public to short stay rentals, and investments are skewed in that direction. And it also pushes the prices of rent upwards in a situation where they are not regulated like hotels. They don't pay the kind of taxes that hotels do, and they mostly operate under the radar. So we have to be hard on short stay rentals and regulate them effectively, because they are also pushing the prices of rents upwards.
Absolutely. I wish today, like, there's no time to discuss a lot of things, but this was quite brilliant. And I'm happy you're with the ADC now. This is how opposition should work, not just being critical, but providing alternative. There's something a young man, I saw him on TikTok, Yinka Obebe, the way he wrote it. I'm going to read it verbatim, literally. He said, Nigeria didn't collapse, we privatized survival. He said, Nigeria didn't fall, it adapted and built private systems for everything the public stopped providing. That adaptation is now one of the biggest business signals in the country.
I mean, that's you couldn't have put it more brilliantly. There's a wonderful Hausa musician and social critic, Maria Jos. I don't know if you heard of him, who did a fabulous song about public housing years ago, who said "Gidang haya by gidabani matala nide samang haya," which translates or loosely translates to the fact that living in rental apartments all your life is almost a burden on you, and what confers dignity and stability on a man is owning your own property. And that vision has been taken away from most working people in Lagos, and that's the biggest generational betrayal in our generation, that the people who enjoy public housing have excluded working people from a pathway to home ownership.
It's a long walk to freedom. We hope we can arrive as quickly and as soon as possible.
I wonder what would happen to luxury houses and all those public houses in the next 10, 15 years. Do you foresee empty houses?
There's 115 currently unoccupied or vacant houses in Lagos today. 115,000, most of them in high-income areas in Lagos. Now imagine if you tax these houses on just a flat tax rate of 200,000 or 500,000 naira a year, as is done in major cities across the world. That will give you 25 billion naira every year that you can use to build 1,000 public housing of 2-bedroom flats.
Okay. It's good to hear. So these are the kinds of conversation I want to hear during the campaigns. Alternative ideas. Yes. Thank you so much, Ayodele Adio.
Thank you.
He's a member of the ADC and chairmanship candidate in the last local government election in Lagos State, trying to go on for the office of chairman in Etiosa. Thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me.
We'll take a break, and when we come back, we'll shift gears to another part of the conversation. Join us again.